On the night of July 24th, 1943, the skies above Germany roared like thunder. It was the opening night of Operation Gemara, the Allied bombing campaign that would devastate Hamburg and forever change aerial warfare. Among the hundreds of aircraft dispatched from England that evening was one Lancaster bomber from No. 50 Squadron, RAF Skellingthorpe. Its call sign, L for Leader. Its mission, simple on paper, strike the industrial heart of Hamburg. Yet, within hours, it would vanish without a trace. The crew of L for Leader had flown together for nearly 6 months. Pilot Officer Alan Fraser, just 23 years old, was considered one of the calmest hands in the squadron. Alongside him were Flight Sergeant William Bill Hargreaves, the navigator, Sergeant Peter Long, wireless operator, and gunners Thomas Keane and Arthur Downey, both veterans of night missions over the Ruhr. The men shared the same gallows humor found in most bomber crews, a quiet understanding that every sortie could be their last. As the ground crew worked under floodlights at Skellingthorpe, the smell of fuel and oil mixed with the chill of an English summer night. Mechanics checked the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines one last time, while armorers loaded their payload, high explosives and incendiaries intended to turn Hamburg's factories into firestorms. One mechanic later recalled, "They looked steady, like they'd done it all before." But something in Fraser's eyes that night. He knew it wasn't just another run. At precisely 22:15, L for Leader joined the bomber stream, climbing through thick cloud into the darkness over the North Sea. Radio discipline was strict. No unnecessary chatter. By the time they crossed the German coast, radar plots from Bomber Command showed over 700 aircraft converging on Hamburg. The city's air defenses were already on high alert. Yet that night, something unusual happened. German radar stations began reporting ghost contacts, false echoes, caused by a new British countermeasure. Thin strips of aluminum foil dropped to confuse enemy radar. Few air crews knew of it, and even fewer understood its purpose. For the men aboard, L for Leader, the sky was a chaos of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. They weaved through tracer rounds and shrapnel bursts as the city below erupted in flames. Witnesses from neighboring bombers later reported seeing Fraser's Lancaster on course over the Elbe River, until it abruptly broke formation. "One moment she was there," said a fellow pilot from 619 Squadron, and the next, nothing. No flare, no explosion, just gone. Back at Skellingthorpe, the operations board was updated through the early hours. By dawn, L for Leader had failed to return. The squadron's intelligence officer, Flight Lieutenant Norman Briggs, logged the crew as missing, presumed dead. But something in the radio logs raised questions. At 1:27 hours, a faint distress call had been received, cut off mid-sentence. "Engine 2, fire." Descending below, silo, the signal vanished. It wasn't repeated. In his post-mission report, Briggs wrote, "Asterisk, radio intercept incomplete. Possible flak damage or engine failure. No confirmation of crash site. Probability of loss, high. Asterisk yet, unofficially, others in the squadron weren't so sure." The path Fraser took, breaking formation near the Elbe, didn't match his assigned flight plan. Some speculated he'd been ordered to test an experimental radar device or decoy system. Others whispered that the bomber had been shot down by friendly fire amid the confusion of the countermeasure tests. The next morning, a single piece of wreckage washed ashore on the Frisian coast. A charred section of fuselage bearing part of a serial number, ED8. It matched at least 3 Lancasters from that raid. Officially, no conclusion could be drawn. The families were notified with the standard letter from the Air Ministry. Asterisk, "We regret to inform you that your son is missing following air operations over enemy territory." Asterisk in the weeks that followed, Operation Gemara continued, reducing Hamburg to rubble. But for those at Skellingthorpe, the loss of L for Leader lingered. Pilot Officer Fraser's personal diary, retrieved from his quarters, contained a final entry dated July 23rd. Asterisk, "New loadout tomorrow. Special equipment. Told not to discuss." Asterisk, it was the only reference to anything unusual in his records. For decades, the story of the missing Lancaster remained buried among the thousands of wartime losses. until historians began piecing together fragments of evidence that suggested something more than a routine bombing mission had taken place that night. Even in official squadron archives, the aircraft's log abruptly stopped, its serial number fading into classified appendices. As one surviving crewman from another Lancaster later put it, sometimes the missions that disappear aren't the ones that failed. They're the ones that never officially happened. And so, the trail of L for leader begins not in flames, but in silence. Its fate swallowed by the darkness over Hamburg, leaving behind only questions and whispers. The next chapter would bring the first real clues: radio logs, wreckage, and the faint traces of a story that refused to stay buried. The morning after the raid, the operations room at RAF Skellingthorpe was eerily quiet. Of the 32 bombers that left the base for Hamburg, 4 failed to return. But it was the disappearance of L for leader that unsettled everyone. There had been no Mayday call, no eyewitness reports of crash, and the last radio message, Engine 2, fire, descending below CLO, cut off so abruptly that even the signals officer questioned whether it had been jammed. The RAF's post-mission intelligence team, led by Flight Lieutenant Norman Briggs, began combing through wireless logs and radar tracks. The official explanation, lost due to flak or night fighter attack, seemed plausible at first. Hamburg had been defended by some of the most lethal anti-aircraft networks in Germany. Over 200 flak 88mm guns and radar-directed searchlights coordinated through the Himmelbett system. Yet something didn't fit. The Lancaster's radar trace ended not over Hamburg, but nearly 30 miles north, over the dark waters near the Elbe estuary, a strange deviation from its assigned bombing route. In his field notes, Briggs scribbled, asterisk, signal interference, intentional deviation, possible test flight, asterisk, he wasn't alone in his doubts. A surviving crew from the same wave, flying a Lancaster from No. 619 Squadron, reported a moment of confusion in the bomber stream. We saw lights below us, like a plane descending slowly. Looked like a Lancaster with one engine out, recalled Navigator James Fenton years later. Then it blinked out. No explosion, just gone. Technically, an aircraft could have ditched into the North Sea, but a clean radio cut, without static or distortion, hinted at something else. Signals intercepts from nearby RAF stations recorded an unusual interference pattern on the same frequency, L for leader, used for its distress call. Some engineers speculated it was German jamming. Others suspected British testing of a classified countermeasure. The deeper Briggs looked, the stranger the paperwork became. Within a week, the missing aircraft's file had been stamped asterisk closed, operational loss. Asterisk, no further inquiry. No wreckage search authorized. Someone wanted this one buried, one of his clerks later said in an interview. Around that time, rumors began circulating through Bomber Command that certain Lancasters on the Hamburg raids had carried special loads, equipment related to the top-secret window operation. The RAF had just begun deploying bundles of aluminum strips to blind German radar, but only a handful of crews had been briefed. Most airmen knew nothing of it. If Fraser's bomber had been testing new radar devices, it might explain the deviation, the interference, and even the sudden silence. Briggs' report to group headquarters included a cautious remark, asterisk, unclear whether aircraft loss due to enemy action or malfunction. Final signal may indicate controlled descent. Recommend further review of electronic interference logs. Asterisk, the recommendation was ignored. The report was filed away, and a replacement crew assigned to L for leaders' old quarters. But for the families, the mystery deepened. Letters to the Air Ministry brought only standard replies. Alan Fraser's father, a retired schoolteacher from Lincolnshire, wrote repeatedly asking for details of the final transmission. None were ever released. We only want to know if they suffered, he wrote in one letter dated September 1943. The response was brief. Asterisk, details of the operation remain classified. Asterisk, unbeknownst to the families, fragments of radio communication from the Hamburg raid have been analyzed at RAF Baudsee, home of Britain's radar research. The analysts noted the oddity, signals on the 124.5 MHz band that didn't match standard bomber frequencies. Some appeared to originate from within the bomber stream itself. The file was marked asterisk, possible equipment trial, do not circulate. Decades later, aviation historian Robert Ellison would obtain a partial copy of that very file. In his 1987 book Echoes Over Europe, he described the case of an unlogged Lancaster possibly engaged in electronic countermeasure testing. Ellison never named the aircraft, but his notes, time, position, and call sign matched L for leader exactly. As the war raged on, the case was forgotten, absorbed into the thousands of RAF losses across occupied Europe. But a handful of men never let go. In a quiet corner of Lincolnshire, a former wireless operator named Peter Long's brother kept a small notebook containing a single phrase scrawled across the back cover. Engine 2. Fire. Descending below silo. The same words that echoed through the static that night. Years later, when that notebook resurfaced in a local museum, researchers began re-examining the possibility that L for leader hadn't been lost by chance at all, but silenced during a mission that was never meant to be recorded. As one wartime intelligence officer later reflected, in war, some disappearances are not accidents. They're the price of secrecy. The next chapter would uncover the first tangible clue, a discovery made in the ruins of post-war Germany that would breathe new life into the mystery of the missing Lancaster. By 1945, the guns had fallen silent, but Europe was a graveyard of secrets. As British troops advanced into the ruins of northern Germany, intelligence teams known as Graves and Inquiry Units scoured fields and forests for missing aircrews. Among them was Flight Lieutenant Norman Briggs, still haunted by the unsolved disappearance of L for leader. When word reached him of a possible Lancaster crash north of Hamburg, he volunteered to investigate. Local villagers in a small farming town near Lake Wittensee recalled a plane coming down 2 years earlier. Low, trailing smoke, but no explosion. We saw it pass behind the trees, one farmer told them, and then nothing, just silence. The villagers assumed it had ditched in the lake, but no wreckage had ever surfaced. The search team arrived in May 1945, equipped with rudimentary diving gear and a small boat borrowed from the Royal Engineers. Within hours, they discovered fragments of twisted metal along the shoreline, small, corroded pieces that appeared to match aircraft aluminum. Stamped faintly on one jagged section was a partial serial number, ED8. It was enough to narrow it down to 3 aircraft missing from the Hamburg raids, including L for leader. Briggs recorded in his field diary, * possible recovery site. Remains uncertain. Locals claim Luftwaffe guards sealed the area days after crash. No wreckage visible. Rumors of equipment removed by German authorities. His words reflected both the hope and the frustration of so many post-war investigators. Every clue seemed to raise more questions than answers. During interviews, one elderly villager mentioned something that caught Briggs' attention. The Germans came at night, she said. Trucks, soldiers, officers. They took things from the water. Boxes, not people. When asked what was in the boxes, she simply shrugged. We were told to stay inside. It wasn't unusual for German forces to recover Allied wrecks for technical analysis, especially those carrying new radar systems. The Luftwaffe's Wissenschaftliche Forschungsgruppe, the scientific research group, had spent years studying British radar countermeasures. If Fraser's Lancaster had been equipped with experimental gear, it might explain the rapid arrival of German units after its crash. But the most chilling discovery came later that week. While combing a nearby copse, a sergeant found a small, mud-caked object, a navigator's logbook, its pages swollen with water. Inside, faint pencil marks recorded flight headings consistent with L for leaders, route over Hamburg. The final entry stopped abruptly. Course 283, altitude 5,000, engine 2 out, holding steady. There was no sign of panic, no note of distress, only calm precision, as if the crew believed they might still make it home. In his debriefing report, Briggs noted, evidence suggests aircraft made controlled descent. No human remains recovered, likely submerged intact. But no further search was approved. Post-war Germany was chaotic, and priorities shifted toward rebuilding and repatriation. L for leader was quietly written off the record as presumed lost over water. Years later, that logbook would resurface in the archives of the RAF Museum at Hendon, mislabeled and forgotten. A handwritten note inside the front cover, added by an unknown clerk, read simply, Asterisk recovered from WWII, Schleswig-Holstein, 1945. Asterisk Briggs' personal reflections, however, never made it into official history. In his private correspondence, found decades after his death, he wrote, Asterisk, there's something wrong about that lake. The villagers spoke as if the earth itself hid the truth. We were told to move on, but I've never shaken the feeling that what went down there was not meant to be found. Asterisk modern researchers reviewing wartime German documents found corroborating hints. A Luftwaffe operations log dated July 25, 1943, mentioned an unidentified crash site near Rendsburg, sealed under the authority of Technische Amt, the technical branch responsible for advanced weapons research. The entry was later struck through in red ink and labeled irrelevant. If that order came from Berlin, it meant one thing. The Germans had found something valuable. In the post-war years, many RAF families received closure through recovered remains or wreckage. But the relatives of the L for Leader crew received nothing. No bodies, no grave markers, only their names on the Runnymede Memorial for Airmen with no known resting place. Still, the lake's legend persisted among locals. Fishermen occasionally dredged up scraps of aluminum, twisted and corroded beyond recognition. Some swore they could still see shapes beneath the water on clear days. A wingtip, a shadow, maybe more. Briggs' last note on the matter read, Asterisk, we looked, but it looked back. Some things are meant to stay where they fell. Asterisk, the official record closed there, but decades later, a new generation of researchers would return to Lake Wittensee. What they found in the 1970s, buried beneath silt and secrecy, would reopen the mystery and suggest that L for Leader was never just another bomber lost to fate. By the 1970s, the Second World War had faded into history books and memorial plaques, yet its ghost still lingered, especially over northern Germany. In 1974, a German aviation researcher named Dieter Mertens began compiling data on downed Allied bombers across Schleswig-Holstein. His goal was academic, to document crash sites for a regional history journal. But one reference stopped him cold. A wartime Luftwaffe log entry from July 1943, hastily crossed out in red ink, mentioning unconfirmed interception, British heavy bomber, vicinity of Rendsburg. That one detail, the red strikeout, was enough to spark Mertens' obsession. He spent months combing local archives, comparing British and German records. The RAF had nothing on file for a confirmed loss in that area. Yet according to Luftwaffe documents, a night fighter patrol led by Oberleutnant Helmut Schultz claimed a probable kill near the Elbe estuary at precisely 1:28 hours, matching the time of L for Leader's final transmission. Schultz's radar operator noted, Asterisk, contact broken before visual confirmation. Target vanished from screen. Asterisk, the report was filed, then rescinded 2 days later. Mertens knew what that meant. During the chaotic Hamburg raids, the Luftwaffe often logged probables that were later deleted if wreckage couldn't be found. But what intrigued him was the language used in Schultz's after-action report. Asterisk, unusual radar response, possible jamming or experimental countermeasure. Asterisk for Mertens. That single phrase hinted at something far beyond a routine shoot-down. To verify his theory, he traveled to London and consulted declassified RAF combat reports at the Public Record Office. There he found confirmation that the RAF had indeed been testing a new technology during Operation Gamara, Project Window, the first widespread use of radar-confusing chaff. The operation's results had been devastating to German radar efficiency. But according to a separate classified annex, a handful of aircraft also carried early electronic countermeasure prototypes, codenamed Mandrill, a device designed to jam enemy radar transmissions. Could L for Leader have been one of them? Returning to Hamburg, Mertens interviewed several surviving Luftwaffe radar technicians. One of them, Karl-Heinz Voigt, then in his 80s, recalled a night when their ground radar screens went haywire. We thought the system had failed, he said. Targets vanished, then reappeared elsewhere. It was chaos. Our controllers shouted that the British had found a way to blind us. When Mertens showed him the map of the Rendsburg area, Voigt nodded slowly. Yes, that's where the signal dropped. We lost contact completely after that point. In 1976, Mertens published a brief paper proposing that the missing Lancaster might have been testing advanced radar countermeasures, and that the Luftwaffe, realizing what had fallen into their territory, had moved quickly to recover the wreck. His conclusions were dismissed by many historians as speculative. Still, the discovery of the redacted night fighter report gave his theory weight. Back in Britain, the story caught the attention of BBC journalist Michael Rawlins, who was preparing a documentary on lost bombers of World War II. He tracked down surviving members of No. 50 Squadron, including a retired ground crew chief named Harold Dent. Dent vividly recalled preparing L for leader on the night of July 24, 1943. "They told us to fit some extra boxes in the nose compartment," he said. "Didn't tell us what it was. Looked like radio gear, heavier than usual. The crew didn't know either. All we were told was, don't ask questions." For Rawlins, that was confirmation enough. The aircraft had likely been equipped with prototype jamming equipment, making it an attractive target for both sides. If the Germans recovered it, they might have gained insight into Britain's radar deception efforts. And if the RAF later discovered that fact, it would explain why the loss report had been sealed and forgotten. Embarrassment mixed with operational secrecy. In his documentary notes, Rawlins wrote, "Asterisk, a missing crew, an erased German record, and an Air Ministry file marked closed equipment trial. If that doesn't speak of cover-up, what does?" Asterisk, the deeper Mertens and Rawlins dug, the clearer the pattern became. Every reference to the crash site, the equipment, or the final signal was either incomplete or deliberately struck out in official files. Even the Luftwaffe radar logs for that night contained abrupt gaps, missing pages where the Rendsburg sector entries should have been. By the time their findings aired on BBC Radio in 1979, L for leader had become more than a mystery. It had become a symbol of how technological secrecy can bury the human cost of war. Families of the crew wrote to the BBC after the broadcast, asking if new searches would be made. None were authorized. Yet the broadcast had one unintended effect. Among the listeners was a diver and amateur historian from Kiel named Stefan Kruger, who decided to see for himself what lay beneath Lake WWII. His dives in the early 1990s would reveal the first tangible proof that the aircraft and its secrets might still be there, hidden beneath decades of silt and silence. The mystery of L for leader was no longer confined to old reports and speculation. It was waiting to be found again. In the summer of 1993, after nearly half a century of rumors, diver and amateur historian Stefan Kruger slipped beneath the surface of Lake WWII. The water was cold and murky, visibility barely a meter, but he was determined. Guided by sonar readings from a local engineering firm, Kruger descended to a depth of nearly 12 meters, and there, half buried in the silt, he saw it. The unmistakable curve of an aircraft's wingtip. It was no fisherman's tale this time. The debris field stretched across nearly 30 meters of lake bed. Twisted aluminum, fragments of perspex from a cockpit canopy, and the faint outline of what might have been a four-engine bomber. When Kruger surfaced, he knew he had found something significant, but he didn't yet know how significant. Over the next several weeks, Kruger and his small team conducted multiple dives, carefully photographing and cataloging each piece. Among the fragments, they found sections of wiring and charred metal consistent with RAF construction, yet no serial plates, no markings, and, most puzzlingly, no human remains. It was as if the plane had been picked clean, Kruger later said, like someone had already been there, long before us. When the team submitted their findings to the German Historical Aviation Society, interest quickly grew. British researchers were contacted, including historian Robert Ellison, the same man who had investigated the radar logs a decade earlier. Ellison confirmed that the debris matched the general construction of an Avro Lancaster, and its position aligned almost perfectly with where L for leader was last recorded. "If this isn't Fraser's aircraft," he remarked, "then it's one hell of a coincidence." Still, there were anomalies. Certain fragments appeared to have been cut with precision tools, not torn by impact. And among the debris, Kruger's team recovered a small, box-shaped object, its casing sealed, its internal wiring burned beyond recognition. Military experts speculated it could have been part of an electronic device, perhaps a radar unit or transmitter. No one could prove it belonged to L for leader, but it fit the growing pattern of secrecy surrounding the case. The discovery reignited public fascination. In Britain, surviving relatives of the missing crew began writing to the Ministry of Defense, asking for an official excavation. The response, once again, was silence. Only a brief statement was issued. Asterisk. The ministry has no current plans to recover remains from German territory. Asterisk, but off the record. One official admitted to a journalist that some of those old missions were best left alone. For the families, that silence was harder to bear than the loss itself. Margaret Fraser, the pilot's niece, described how her father received a terse reply from the RAF in 1943 and nothing more. "They told us to forget," she said in a 1994 interview. "But how can you forget when there's still no grave? My uncle's plane went missing in a war full of death, but something about this one was different. It was like they didn't want it found." Kruger's dives also revealed one final, haunting clue. Near the tail section, he found a fragment of green-painted metal, part of an access panel. Inside was a small, brass tag stamped with faint lettering. Asterisk, Mod, Experimental Unit, Property of Aid. Asterisk, the Air Inspection Department, known for overseeing classified aviation trials, had existed only briefly during the war. No bomber on a standard Hamburg mission would have carried their equipment. When Ellison presented these findings at a 1995 symposium on wartime radar research, he ended his talk with a quiet observation. Asterisk, sometimes history hides not to deceive, but to protect. Perhaps this crew were pioneers of a weapon they never lived to see succeed. Asterisk, still, the question lingered. Why no remains? Some speculated that the crew bailed out and were captured, their fate lost in the chaos of late war Germany. Others believe the aircraft was partially salvaged by the Germans soon after it crashed, leaving nothing but scraps behind. But if so, where were the official records? A former Luftwaffe archivist once told Mertens, the German researcher, "We were ordered to hand over all captured British technology to the SS Research Division. Files went to Berlin. After that, nothing. They disappeared in the firestorm." By the late 1990s, the site was officially classified as a war grave, and diving was restricted. The wreckage was left undisturbed, a silent witness beneath the water. Yet whispers persisted that fragments had been quietly removed by private collectors, or perhaps by officials looking to keep certain evidence from resurfacing. For Margaret Fraser and the families, the unanswered questions remained painful but familiar. In a BBC interview marking the 50th anniversary of the crew's disappearance, she said softly, "If they died testing something that saved others, then they deserve to be remembered for that. But I think we'll never know the truth. Not the whole of it." The lake kept its silence. But in 2012, long after Kruger's discovery had faded from headlines, a release of newly declassified RAF documents would bring the story full circle and reveal at last what L for leader had truly been carrying on that fateful night over Hamburg. In 2012, nearly 70 years after L for leader vanished into the night skies over Hamburg, a quiet release of declassified RAF documents changed everything. Within a collection labeled Air Ministry Technical Records, Radar Development, 1943-44, historians uncovered several previously unseen files. One bore a simple but chilling title, Asterisk, Operation Window, Associated Countermeasure Trials, July 1943. Asterisk inside were handwritten notes and typed reports detailing experimental radar jamming equipment fitted to selected aircraft of No. 50 Squadron. Among them was a clear entry, serial number ED-886, the very Lancaster flown by Pilot Officer Alan Fraser. The notes confirmed what generations of researchers had only guessed. The bomber had been part of a secret mission to test a prototype jammer, codenamed Mandrel Beta. Its purpose was to disrupt the German Freya and Würzburg radar networks during the early stages of the Hamburg raid. The report also included a chilling annotation. Asterisk, crew fully briefed not to transmit operational details. Equipment sensitive. If compromised, classify mission as standard bombing loss. Asterisk, historians were stunned. L for leader hadn't merely been part of the bombing stream. It had been carrying one of the first operational electronic warfare systems in history. The aircraft's deviation from formation and the mysterious interference recorded by both British and German logs suddenly made sense. Fraser's crew had likely encountered a technical malfunction, perhaps even fire, caused by the untested equipment. And with strict radio silence and classified orders, their last, broken message, Engine 2, fire, descending below CLO, was all they could manage. Yet the revelations didn't end there. Another document, stamped secret, do not release until reviewed, described the aftermath of the mission. British intelligence learned through post-war interrogation of German officers that the Luftwaffe had indeed recovered a crash bomber near Rendsburg in July 1943. Its wreckage was removed under orders from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium's technical branch for research purposes. The file concluded bluntly, asterisk, recovery confirmed, crew not located, presumed deceased. Asterisk, in other words, the Germans had likely found L for leader and whatever secrets it carried. But why had the Air Ministry kept this information hidden for so long? One historian from the RAF Museum suggested the answer was simple. Window and mandrel were among the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Revealing that a crew and the technology had fallen into enemy hands would have been a propaganda disaster at the time. The men became victims not only of war, the historian said, but of silence. Their deaths were classified. The final pages of the file offered a poignant coda. A memo dated 1950, written by an Air Ministry official, stated, asterisk, given the nature of their work, it is recommended that official correspondence to next of kin remain limited to standard operational loss language. Asterisk, it was bureaucratic language, concealing human tragedy, orders to keep families in the dark for the sake of national security. When the files were made public, journalists revisited the story. BBC Radio Lincolnshire ran a special segment titled Asterisk, The Lost Crew of Mandrel. Asterisk Margaret Fraser, by then in her 80s, listened from her home. They always said he died doing his duty, she said quietly, but now I know what that really meant. He was part of something greater, something no one could talk about. Dieter Mertens, the German researcher whose decades-long quest had helped uncover the truth, visited Lake Wittensee one final time that year. Standing on the shore, he dropped a small wreath into the still water. This, he said to the camera crew beside him, is not just a grave. It's a monument to a silence that lasted 70 years. Even now, the full story of what happened that night remains partly obscured. No official excavation of the wreck has ever been sanctioned. Some fragments may still lie deep beneath the mud, perhaps even remnants of the Mandrel Beta device itself. But what we do know is enough to reframe their legacy. Fraser and his crew were pioneers of electronic warfare, flying into uncharted territory with technology that would later save thousands of Allied airmen. They died not in vain, but in secrecy, a secrecy that outlasted them by generations. As the historian Robert Ellison concluded in his final essay on the case, asterisk, they flew not merely to destroy, but to deceive. Their mission was to make the enemy blind, and in doing so, they became invisible themselves. Asterisk, the mystery of L for leader may never be fully solved, but one truth endures. In the dark skies over Hamburg, amid fire and silence, 7 men carried the future of modern warfare into the unknown and vanished into history.